Tyler Harris.
And I'm Athokshay Ashok.
The issue at hand is that Anna and Carlos have a child, Vincent, who has a rare form of cancer. The only two forms of treating it is chemotherapy and a bone marrow transplant, or possibly everything below a kidney transplant, so nothing more dangerous than a kidney transplant. So what they did was they birthed another child named Thomas in hopes of him having the correct proteins in his bone marrow tissue to match Vincent.
And today we shall be arguing that it is just and right for Anna and Carlos for having doing so, and we shall be supporting it with multiple points.
First, chemotherapy is a very risky treatment that lasts even beyond the ending of the cancer.
It is extremely expensive and it lasts for your entire life, making it much more dangerous and no guarantee of cure.
2, Thomas is not he's not giving them against his will. Just because he's afraid of needles, in this case he is, doesn't mean that he doesn't want to donate. They're not harvesting his organs or anything.
Yes, he's not being trafficked or being killed for his organs. He is donating blood or tissue or bone marrow by his will to help his brother.
3, bone marrow transplants only last once unless another cancer somehow reforms due to the chemotherapy that sometimes occurs after the bone marrow transplant. That's very, very rare. Chemotherapy actually can cause another second cancer.
It is a one-time cure or prevention, although not guaranteed. It has a higher chance than chemotherapy, and over 60,000 patients have been cured of such cancerous diseases or from 1980s. So it is extremely reliable.
Hello, my name is Anudeep Deevi.
Hello, and my name is Shyam Paidipati.
And we're here discussing the vignette of Anna and Carlos. Let me ask you a question first. Is it moral to have a second child just so its tissues and organs can be harvested for the first child? Of course not. It is not moral for Anna and Carlos to have Thomas because, first of all, scientifically, chemotherapy has a much less chance of relapsing or reoccurring later in life than a transplant, meaning more intrusive transplants are required in the coming years.
Also, scientifically, chemotherapy has less severe side effects than bone marrow transplant and other transplants of other sorts. This means that it's safer for safer for Vincent, who has this rare form of cancer, to continue with chemotherapy, but it's a safer and more moral way of curing or treating his cancer. Also, from a social standpoint, harvesting a child's organs and having a child just harvest his organs has no moral standards at all. A child should be cherished and should be taken care of by its parents, not used just as a resource. Also, from a legal standpoint, human trafficking is not legal. When human trafficking is when people use other humans as resources and use them for their own needs. Anna and Carlos are using Thomas just so that Vincent has a slightly better chance of fixing his cancer's problem than treating Thomas as a human being. I believe this has no moral standards, and it should not be considered into thought for any decision in the future.
Anna and Carlos should not raise their children equally, but not one as a human harvest, another one overly affected with love. Thank you.
People might say that bone marrow transplants are not completely reliable and don't have a high success rate. They are much more reliable than chemotherapy, and as we have found from our sources, bone marrow transplants are 97% more reliable than chemotherapy.
Actually, I'm going to correct him on that. Chemotherapy is unreliable 97% of the time, and also up to 3% of the time. Most of the time, you'll have to keep taking medicine after the cancer is cured, and you'll have lifelong after effects such as nausea, lose your hair, obviously.
Also, while some people say that this is considered human trafficking, we disagree, as we say that human trafficking is the buying and selling of human bodies in order to harvest their organs to save another person's life, and this obviously is not the case here.
It's not like Thomas is actually screaming and crying saying he doesn't want to donate. He's afraid of needles. If we figure out a way in the future to somehow reduce the use of needles or something like that, then problem solved. Thomas can donate, because it's not like he doesn't want to save his brother.
Also, they're not taking anything more, as he said, than mainly his kidneys, tissues, or in some cases, blood and bone marrow. So it is not as though they'll be murdering or slaughtering Thomas in order to save one son. And there's also a social problem to this, that some people might say that they're having to, it's not moral to harvest a child just for saving another, but we say, is it worth killing one than saving both?
Gentlemen, you've made some valid points in your argument. However, I fail to see the logic behind your arguments. First, you stated that chemotherapy is much more expensive than bone transplant. But in a recent study, bone transplants have racked up from $250,000 to $500,000 in cash. And since this is a new procedure, most insurance companies, most popular ones, won't pay for this, meaning that the entire family is stuck with the entire bill and the entire check. The next one will be rebuttal by my partner.
Also, for a bone marrow transplant to happen, the donor and the recipient has to have a very close blood match. This means that Vincent has to have a 97% match with Thomas. This is very rare, and although scientists during the time have found a match between the two donors, it still has a very low percentage of working. Recent studies have shown bone marrow transplants only work 50% of the time. As Anudeep said, due to the $250,000 to $500,000 bill, a 60% chance is not high enough for most families. Also, chemotherapy, bone marrow transplants have many side effects that are very harmful to the recipient. For example, there are fatigue, pain, and severe nausea while receiving the bone marrow transplant. Also, you have to take a medication consistently after taking a bone marrow transplant. Chemotherapy, on the other hand, is, although it has to be during your whole lifetime, it's not cheap, but has very little side effects that will affect the recipient.
Go.
We would like to conclude by saying that chemotherapy is nowhere as close to being as effective as bone marrow transplants.
Although you're introducing a whole other set of nearly compatible DNA into a person's body when you do a bone marrow transplant, you're still required to take medicine to, compete with the nearly compatible DNA sets. But, I mean, it's way less medicine than chemotherapy where they just pump you full of drugs. It causes a lot of side effects.
And side effects of chemotherapy include nausea, pain, trauma, a lot of hair loss, and this is not a good idea to inflict upon a small kid who's already battling a rare form of cancer.
Scientifically, bone marrow transplants are so much higher in rates of effectiveness.
And we must keep in mind that two parents are trying to save their child who's, as we said, going through a hard time right now, and this could be the only way they can save him.
Yeah, and this is nowhere near human trafficking. It's nowhere near.
Yeah, we're not killing the child to save the other one, and we'd like to conclude by saying that is a life full of pain the same as death?
Thank you.
In conclusion, Anna and Carlos are not rightly justified in having Thomas just for the sole purpose of saving their first child, Vincent. We believe scientifically that chemotherapy is a safer and less harmful way of helping Vincent through his cancer than harvesting a second child's organs, such as Thomas, to help save Vincent.
Also, the social implication of the situation is it's immoral to harvest a child for their organs and tissues. I mean, after all, a human can experience pain and emotion on both sides, not just Vincent or Thomas. Thomas is one giving the bone marrow transplant, and Vincent's one receiving it. He's getting pain on both sides, okay? So, legal standpoint, the act of having a second child for such a purpose is human trafficking. When you're using a child only for its organ and tissues, and not for the love and care that it so rightfully deserves, it is human trafficking. A child is a human being, and should be treated as such. Thank you, and goodbye.